It is a dog-eat-dog world, but in this case, we're talking about snakes. Dozens of snakes were released into the wild in North Florida.
When Florida announced its plan to release predators into the wild, the world laughed. It sounded reckless, even dangerous. But behind the controversy was a science experiment.
It began with a startling announcement. The state of Florida had unleashed an army of python-killing creatures, thousands of them, into the wild. And what happened next sent ripples through scientific circles, conservation communities, and the very fabric of Florida's wilderness. In the sprawling, marsh-laden expanse of the Everglades and other low-lying ecosystems, the invasive giant constrictor known as the Burmese python had long reigned unchallenged, slipping unseen through the saw palmettos, preying on mammals, birds, and even reptiles, resisting all efforts to keep it in check. Yet the strategy that followed, releasing countless external predators or python killers into zones of python dominance, ushered in a cascade of effects that none fully expected. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The logic of the release was simple, though bold. The Burmese python had grown too abundant, too entrenched, with reproduction rates that could reach upward of tens of eggs per clutch, and behavior that allowed stealthy predation of native wildlife. The python's presence had become more than a nuisance. It was a threat to biodiversity, native predators, and ecosystem balance. Authorities reasoned that an influx of dedicated python-killing agents, whether biological, mechanical, or robotic, might tip the balance. These new creatures would roam territories long dominated by the pythons, hunting them down with efficiency and purpose, turning the tables on what had long seemed an invader with the advantage. In the immediate days following the release, scenes of dramatic confrontation played out across Florida's wilderness. The python killers moved into place with the stealth of hunters, melding into the swampy terrain, tracking the serpents through dense brush, water-filled channels, and midnight mist. The pythons, masters of camouflage and concealment, found themselves hunted in ways they had not anticipated. Where previously they had slithered undetected, the tide had turned and now they were pursued. The result was an uptick in python fatalities, a disruption of their patterns, and an early sense that the ecosystem was undergoing a seismic shift. One of the more tangible outcomes was a reduction in the number of extremely large, mature pythons that dominated the food web. These behemoths, often more than 15 or 20 feet in length, had for years eaten many of the prey species that native predators relied on. With the new python killers on the scene, some of these largest pythons began to disappear. The removal of those apex-level invaders opened up space in the ecosystem. Indigenous predators that had been starved of prey, bobcats, foxes, raccoons, and even smaller alligators, sensed openings. The contacts and tracking data showed shifts. Fewer giant pythons, more visible prey species where the hunting pressure had eased ever so slightly. That said, the release also exposed just how cunning and resilient the pythons truly were. The python killers, while effective, could not every time locate a hidden snake tucked in a limestone outcrop or submerged beneath swamp water. The prey-rich environment that had served the pythons so well also shielded them. In some sectors, the python killers found nests, but in others, the reptiles simply vanished from sight, retreating into shadows where even the best tracking technology struggled. It became clear soon that the hunt was neither straightforward nor guaranteed to succeed in all pockets of the Everglades labyrinth. Meanwhile, the ripple effects extended beyond direct predator-prey encounters. With fewer dominant pythons in certain areas, prey species began to perceive a slightly different world. Creatures that had once lived in near constant fear of being swallowed whole sensed a reduction in immediate danger. Marsh rabbits emerged more frequently, ground-nesting birds moved into territories previously suppressed, and the undergrowth shifted as small mammal populations rebounded here and there. The ecosystem, though still profoundly altered, had begun to show signs of strain moving toward realignment. The dark dominance of the pythons, while not ended, had been cracked. Another striking implication came in how it changed conservation strategy. The python killers were not just brute force. They were paired with tracking systems, telemetry, remote sensors, and robotic decoys in some areas, an acknowledgement that pythons were not going to be removed simply by brute hunting. Scientists learned that each time a python was eliminated, all its future offspring were effectively prevented from entering the system. This multiplier effect meant that targeting reproductive females, or ones tucked into active nests, became the most efficient way to shift the balance. The introduction of the python-killing creatures amplified that strategy. These creatures could seek out nest areas, flush out hidden individuals, and deliver a disruption that cascaded across generations. Yet there were shadows in that story as well. The introduction of a new predator or killer species into an environment already in flux is rarely clean. Questions emerged around unintended consequences. What would happen to the food chain when an invasive predator is itself targeted so aggressively? Would the python killers themselves alter prey communities or displace other, more benign predators? Conservationists grappled with the fact that while the pythons were clearly destructive, the remedy was complex and acted in a region that was already fragile. The Everglades ecosystem, with its mix of wetlands, waterways, tree islands, and unique flora and fauna, is notoriously difficult to manage. Flood control, sea level rise, nutrient pollution, and invasive plants compound the problem. The arrival of a large-scale predator eradication campaign via the released killers added to that matrix. On the human side, the event triggered reactions across local communities, wildlife agencies, and scientific labs. For the first time in some areas, residents living near the Everglades recognized the hunting of pythons as not just a novelty, but a serious, large-scale effort. The idea of thousands of python-killing creatures roaming the swamps became both a symbol and a reality of Florida's war on invasive species. The broader narrative shifted. This was no longer just about removing pet snakes gone rogue. This was a calculated move, a deep investment to restore some semblance of balance to an ecosystem on edge. Support from agencies surged, funding for tracking and removal rose, and the public conversation turned toward questions of ecological justice. What rights native species held, how humans enabled invasions, and how restoration efforts ought to proceed. An unexpected byproduct was the change in how the pythons themselves behaved. With increased pressure from the killers, some snakes altered their movement patterns, timing hunts differently, and sought refuge in less obvious terrain or deeper water. Researchers noted subtle changes. Pythons might avoid previously used foraging grounds, their nesting sites shifted, and the normal seasonal cues for mating or egg-laying appeared to change in response to the heightened threat. This behavioral plasticity highlighted how adaptable the pythons were, and how pushing their population required not just brute removal, but nuanced strategy. The python killers had forced the issue. The invader could no longer roam at leisure, and the ecosystem had responded. The broader ecological implications cannot be overstated. The Everglades, once teeming with marsh rabbits, foxes, raccoons, wading birds, and small mammals, had been hollowed in many sectors by the pythons. With their predation knocking small mammal numbers down by more than 90% in some areas, the food chain had collapsed at the middle tier. When the python-killing creatures entered, they shifted that collapse into a potential rebuild. As prey rebounded, predators higher up the food chain got breathing room. Wading birds returned, insectivorous mammals perked back up, and even nutrient flows began to shift as carcasses of prey and predator alike found different patterns of decay, scavenging, and nutrient release. It was the kind of subtle yet profound change that plays out over years, but it began visibly here. Yet, it also exposed the limits of human intervention in wild systems. The terrain of the Everglades, vast, swampy, interlaced with waterways, and inundated often, proved a formidable challenge. The python killers could only cover so much ground. Many pythons remained hidden. Even as thousands were removed, estimates still suggested tens of thousands remained. The problem was not just in numbers, but in detectability. Pythons are cryptic. They hide, they bask underwater, and they vanish into thick vegetation. The released creatures hunted them, but the ecosystem itself imposed boundaries on how complete that hunt could ever be. The discovery that detection rates were extraordinarily low, less than 1% in some studies, underscored the scale of the challenge. Moreover, the event drew attention to the ethical dimensions. The python killers were human-designed interventions with funding, technology, and training behind them. The question of how humans shape ecosystems, deliberately introduce new agents into the wild, and wage war on species became immediate. Conservationists had to balance the urgency of removing the pythons with responsibility for the non-target effects of their own tools. The released creatures, though praised in many quarters as heroes in the fight, became part of a larger moral equation. When do we intervene? How far do we go? And what does restoration really mean when an ecosystem has been altered so dramatically? In many ways, the event reframed how Florida perceived invasive species management. Previously, efforts had been piecemeal: occasional hunts, community awareness campaigns, bounty programs, the annual Florida Python Challenge. The release of the python-killing creatures marked a transition from reactive removal to proactive ecosystem rebalancing. It sent a message that Florida would not simply try to suppress the pythons, it would go on the offensive. That shift carried implications not only for the Everglades, but for conservation models nationwide. If this war could be waged, and even partially won, then other ecosystems facing non-native predators might take note and emulate the model. Yet the event also reinforced the reality that there are no quick fixes. Some localities saw small mammal recovery, but others remained python-dominated. The disparities in terrain, human access, funding, and research capacity meant that the impact of the released killers varied widely. In deeper, less accessible wetlands, the pythons maintained a foothold. In more open areas, the pressure was greater. The released creatures were effective, but not omnipotent. It became a reminder that restoration is a marathon, not a sprint. On a scientific level, the data gathered during the event opened doors. Researchers began to capture not only more pythons, but more information about their nesting, movement, mating behaviors, and survival in the face of pressure. The presence of the python killers created opportunities to track changes in python demographics, size class shifts, nest density changes, prey-base rebounds, and predator-prey interactions. It became a living laboratory in which the invasive predator was not just removed, but studied under duress. Those insights will shape future efforts, whether via tracking scout snakes, drone monitoring, or even robotic decoys aimed at pythons themselves. There was also an economic dimension. The cost of deploying and managing the python-killing creatures, training, technology, monitoring, compensation, follow-up was substantial. But the potential savings in ecosystem services, biodiversity restoration, and reduction in predator-induced losses added a counterbalance. Some local communities began to feel the tangential benefits of a less python-dominated wilderness: improved hunting and fishing for native game, more sightings of traditional wildlife, enhanced ecotourism opportunities. While not immediate, the promise of ecological rebound brought hope that the investment could pay off. From a broader ecological lens, the event underscored the fragility of ecosystems when faced with invasive species, and the lengths humans must sometimes go to correct their own introductions. The Burmese python problem had begun decades ago. Via the pet trade, hurricane damage to breeding facilities, escapes and releases. In many ways, the python-killing creature deployment was a direct response to a chain of human-enabled missteps. It drove home the notion that once an invasive predator is established, controlling it requires not only manpower and will, but imagination, innovation, and scale. The implications for ecosystem balance were profound. Native predators like the Florida panther, bobcats, and alligators had long been deprived of prey by pythons. With the pressure eased, those predators began to reclaim territory, not fully, but tentatively. The food web started to reconfigure. Where once pythons monopolized large prey items, now there were openings. The vegetation responded too. Fewer small mammals meant fewer burrowing effects, fewer seed dispersal interactions, fewer predator alarm calls reverberating through the underbrush. In essence, the ecosystem that had been co-opted by an invader was nudged back toward its original trajectory, though whether fully or permanently remained to be seen. Yet the event also carried cautionary notes. The released python killers did not eradicate the pythons. They shifted the dynamic. The fight continues. Some scientists caution that the momentum might slow, that the hunters of pythons might become weary, that funding might slump. The dramatic early phase of the release carried adrenaline, but long-term persistence would determine whether the shift held. The pythons' cryptic nature, their deep reservoirs of survivors, their capacity for rapid reproduction, all remained. So too did the terrain's intractability. The event raised questions about scalability. Can this model work across the entire range of the pythons in Florida? Or is it limited to pockets? In closing, the release of thousands of python-killing creatures in Florida was more than a headline stunt or a conservation novelty. It represented a pivotal moment in invasive species management. It laid bare the stakes of the Burmese python crisis, it revealed the lengths to which humans must go to restore fragmented ecosystems, and it opened a new chapter in the relationship between intervention and nature. The high stakes, the dramatic action, the ecological tremors, they all speak to one thing. When you unleash a predator on predators, you change everything. The momentum that surged through Florida following the release of the python-killing creatures carried with it a sense of daring unmatched in the history of American wildlife management. For years, researchers and hunters had fought an uphill battle against a silent, slithering enemy that spread across hundreds of miles of wetlands. Now, for the first time, it seemed as though humanity had unleashed something capable of turning the tide. But beneath the excitement ran a deep current of uncertainty, because introducing an army of predators into an already fragile system is not merely an act of restoration. It's an act of ecological experimentation, played out on a living stage. The newly released python killers, designed to home in on serpentine heat signatures and scent trails, fanned across the swamp like an invisible tide. They were not traditional predators in the sense of a single species. They represented a mosaic of biological agents and engineered trackers, each serving a distinct role in locating and destroying the invasive snakes. Some were mammals bred and trained for scent detection, capable of locating python nests buried beneath debris or within burrows. Others were smaller, low-to-ground drones with thermal imaging cameras designed to move silently through underbrush where human hunters couldn't tread. The synergy between organic and technological hunters was deliberate. Florida's scientists knew that combating an invader as cunning and elusive as the Burmese python required blending instinct with innovation. Almost immediately, the wetlands pulsed with new patterns of movement. Sensors picked up shifts in heat signatures, trails of displacement through sawgrass and cattail fields, evidence that both pythons and their hunters were adjusting to each other's presence. Biologists stationed in observation towers described the marshlands as alive with motion. But what they were witnessing was not harmony. It was a kind of ecological duel. For every python cornered or flushed from its lair, others adapted, moving to colder, deeper waters where their body temperatures blended with the environment, confounding the heat-seeking technology meant to expose them. The chase had become a battle of intelligence and instinct. The energy surrounding the operation spread far beyond the Everglades. News crews captured aerial footage of boats sweeping through channels where hunters and researchers coordinated the release zones. Viewers across the country watched in fascination as the footage showed shimmering trails cut through the reeds by both machines and animals. For the public, the narrative was clear. Florida had taken an extraordinary gamble in the fight to reclaim its wilderness. What was less visible, however, was the careful calculus behind every decision, the balance between eradicating an invader and preserving the integrity of a landscape that had already endured centuries of human alteration. Deep within the interior of the glades, field teams began collecting data almost hourly. Carcasses of pythons revealed not only population reduction but also new behavioral clues. Females that had stopped laying eggs earlier than expected, males showing changes in territorial range, and smaller juveniles appearing in locations where no adults had been found. These shifts indicated disruption. The python killers weren't just removing individuals, they were breaking breeding cycles. To the biologists analyzing these patterns, it was the first tangible sign that the war might not only be winnable, but transformative. Still, the magnitude of the experiment forced everyone involved to confront the question of control. The python killers were efficient, yes, but they were also independent once released. They roamed according to scent, heat, or programmed paths, and sometimes those paths crossed with native species. Reports began filtering in of incidental encounters with alligators, river otters, and even endangered birds. Most were minor, but they illustrated the delicate tension of deploying power into the wild. The swamp was not a controlled laboratory, it was a living matrix, and every new force introduced into it sent unpredictable ripples outward. What captivated ecologists most was how the Everglades itself responded. An ecosystem is not merely a backdrop, it reacts, absorbs, and reshapes around whatever enters it. Within weeks, subtle but measurable transformations began to occur. Areas long dominated by python scent, normally avoided by raccoons and rabbits, started showing signs of recolonization. Tracks reappeared on muddy banks, fresh burrows pocked the soft soil, and certain bird calls once silenced by predation returned. These were fragile indications, but they spoke volumes. They revealed that the balance of fear, the hierarchy of predator and prey, had begun to shift. From a distance, the changes were almost imperceptible. Yet for those who knew the Everglades intimately, the difference was profound. Airboat captains who had guided tourists for decades remarked that the wetlands seemed to breathe differently. The heavy stillness that often accompanied python territory gave way to movement, to life scurrying across the reeds. This sensory transformation wasn't just poetic. It was ecological evidence that the apex threat had been partially displaced. But within that rebirth lay an unanswered question. Could the new equilibrium hold? Or was it merely a temporary lull before another swing of imbalance? The python crisis had always been a lesson in unintended consequences. It began with a few released pets and escalated into one of the most severe ecological invasions in North America. The introduction of the python killers, while strategic, carried the same potential for unexpected outcomes. Biologists worked tirelessly to ensure that none of the released species could become invasive themselves. Their life cycles were studied, their breeding controlled, and their diets monitored to prevent collateral predation. It was a delicate balance. Destroy the invader without creating a successor. Beyond the ecological sphere, the event transformed Florida's identity in ways few anticipated. Once mocked for its python hunts and snake bounties, the state now became a hub for experimental conservation technology. Universities collaborated with tech companies to refine tracking algorithms. Bioengineers designed better scent sensors, and local entrepreneurs developed drones capable of navigating the dense canopies where many pythons hid. The project's reach extended into classrooms, inspiring students to study wildlife management and environmental engineering. What began as an act of desperation evolved into a symbol of innovation, yet for the hunters on the ground, the reality remained grittier. Wading through knee-deep mud at midnight, surrounded by the drone of insects and the heavy scent of rot, they understood that each kill represented not just victory, but persistence. The Burmese python was not an ordinary foe. It was a species that had adapted perfectly to the Everglades chaos. The hunters watched as some snakes fought with astonishing ferocity, their muscular coils lashing out against traps and detectors. It was a reminder that nature's resilience is as awe-inspiring as it is formidable. The psychological effect of the campaign also fascinated observers. For years, Floridians had felt powerless against the serpentine spread. Sightings in backyards, on golf courses, even near urban drainage systems had become unnervingly common. The release of the python killers restored a sense of agency. Communities once haunted by the idea of unstoppable snakes now saw visible action. Local schools organized Everglades restoration days, and volunteer cleanups multiplied. Conservation wasn't just a governmental affair anymore. It became a shared cultural mission. Florida's war on pythons evolved into a movement, a rare instance where environmental urgency united communities across political and social divides. Still, for all the momentum, the ecosystem's response continued to confound expectations. In regions where the python killers had dramatically reduced snake numbers, certain mesopredators began to surge. Armadillos, raccoons, and opossums expanded their ranges quickly, exploiting the temporary vacuum left by the python's absence. This phenomenon, ecological release, posed a new challenge. Without the suppressive weight of the invasive predator, some native species risked overpopulating, disrupting the very balance restoration efforts sought to achieve. It was a sobering reminder that ecosystems are not machines to be tuned. They are self-organizing systems that resist simple solutions. Meanwhile, data collected from the field began feeding into new predictive models. Researchers employed artificial intelligence to map how python populations might respond to ongoing pressure. These simulations revealed that while the kill rate was impressive, complete eradication remained mathematically improbable. The snake's reproductive capacity ensured that even a small number of survivors could repopulate vast areas within a few years. Yet these same models also showed hope. Sustained suppression over multiple generations could stabilize the ecosystem at a new, healthier equilibrium. one where pythons were no longer dominant but merely present. It was not annihilation, but it was victory in ecological terms. One of the more unexpected ripple effects came from tourism. As word of the python killers spread, curiosity drew people from around the world. Wildlife enthusiasts, photographers, and documentarians descended upon the state, eager to witness a living experiment in predator control. Local airboat companies began offering conservation expeditions, where visitors could learn about tracking methods, the anatomy of pythons, and the cutting-edge technology behind the operation. The Everglades, long known for its haunting beauty, now bore an additional identity, a battleground where science met nature head-on. For some, this was a revitalization of the region's economy. For others, it raised concerns that spectacle might overshadow science. Behind the scenes, though, the heart of the mission remained scientific rigor. Each python carcass collected underwent meticulous analysis. Researchers dissected stomach contents to document prey species, extracted tissue samples to study toxins and pathogens, and even mapped genetic variations to track breeding lineages. These findings unveiled previously unknown dynamics, hybridization among python subspecies, hidden migration corridors, and evidence that some pythons had developed partial resistance to tranquilizers used in earlier control efforts. Such adaptability reaffirmed the need for constant innovation in the fight. One of the most compelling revelations involved the wetlands themselves. By studying soil and water chemistry in areas where python activity declined, scientists discovered subtle improvements in nutrient distribution. Without the heavy predation that wiped out small mammals, more organic material accumulated in the marsh. This shifted microbial activity, altering carbon cycling and affecting how the ecosystem stored greenhouse gases. In essence, removing pythons didn't just restore animal populations, it began to heal the biochemical heartbeat of the Everglades. That realization expanded the stakes of the campaign far beyond Florida's borders. It became a model for how invasive species removal could contribute to global climate resilience. But as months passed, the novelty of the release began to give way to the realities of maintenance. The python killers, powerful as they were, required oversight. Their monitoring systems needed recalibration, their territorial ranges reevaluated. Some areas showed diminishing returns as surviving pythons learned to avoid the regions where hunters concentrated their efforts. Adaptive management became the mantra. Change tactics constantly. Never allow the enemy to predict your move. Researchers began experimenting with pheromone lures, decoy nests, and even audio playbacks mimicking prey species to draw out the snakes. The battlefield had turned into an evolving chessboard. At the heart of the endeavor lay a philosophical question that haunted many of its architects. Were humans restoring balance or imposing a new one? By releasing python killers, people had once again intervened in a system already shaped by their earlier mistakes. Some critics argued that the operation, while effective, symbolized humanity's endless cycle of control, solving one problem by creating another. Yet supporters countered that in an age of accelerating biodiversity loss, inaction was the greater sin. The Everglades could no longer self-correct. It needed a guiding hand, even if imperfect. This tension, between humility and hubris, defined much of the discourse around the project. The scale of coordination behind the scenes was staggering. State agencies worked alongside federal wildlife divisions, private research labs, indigenous communities, and local volunteers. The Seminole and Miccosukee tribes, whose ancestral lands intersected with many release zones, played vital roles in monitoring wildlife response. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain and animal behavior proved invaluable. They guided researchers through sections of swamp unreachable by vehicles, translating subtle environmental cues, changes in bird calls, water clarity, or wind direction, that indicated shifts invisible to technology. This collaboration was one of the event's quiet triumphs, a merging of ancient ecological wisdom and modern science in pursuit of a common goal. As the operation unfolded, global eyes turned to Florida as both a pioneer and a cautionary tale. Other regions battling invasive predators, Australia with its cane toads, Guam with its brown tree snakes, Hawaii with feral pigs, watched closely. Could a similar large-scale biological intervention work elsewhere? The early successes inspired cautious optimism, yet ecologists warned that no two ecosystems are alike. What worked in Florida's subtropical wetlands might fail catastrophically in a drier or more isolated environment. The lesson wasn't replication, it was adaptation. In the midst of all the scientific and logistical progress, a quieter transformation was happening among the people themselves. The python killer release rekindled something often lost in modern life, a sense of connection to the natural world. Volunteers described feelings of awe watching sunrise mist curl over wetlands now alive with the calls of returning birds. Teachers brought students to observation decks to witness firsthand the complexity of ecological restoration. The project reminded Floridians that the battle for their environment was not abstract policy. It was something they could see, smell, and touch. It stirred a pride rooted not in domination of nature, but in stewardship. The technological advancements that emerged from the campaign began spilling into other fields. The thermal drones and motion algorithms developed to locate snakes found new applications in wildfire detection, search and rescue missions, and agricultural pest control. The scent detection methods pioneered for python tracking were repurposed for detecting invasive insects and monitoring endangered species. Florida's fight against the pythons became a crucible for innovation that rippled into unexpected sectors. Even the military took interest, studying how autonomous detection systems could operate in complex terrains under limited visibility. A war against snakes had inadvertently advanced the frontier of field robotics. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Florida releasing creatures to hunt invasive pythons? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.